The glass didn't break loudly, but it was loud enough for everyone to remember exactly where they were when it happened. 60 people sat under soft chandelier light inside a 5-star restaurant on Park Avenue, forks paused midair, conversations dissolving into a strange, uneasy silence as something shifted at table 17, the kind of shift that doesn't belong in a place where a single dinner costs more than most people's weekly paycheck, and right at the center of it all was Emily Carter, 7 months pregnant. One hand resting gently on the curve of her belly as if trying to steady something deeper than herself, her breathing controlled, her posture careful, like someone who had learned to survive storms by becoming quiet before they hit, and across from her sat Daniel Hayes, a man worth over $80 million, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him like power itself, his jaw tight, his patience thinner than the crystal glass he had just set down a little too hard, the faint clink echoing longer than it should have. Because moments like that always stretch when something is about to go wrong. And to Emily's right, uninvited but very much present, sat Vanessa Cole, her red dress catching the light just enough to demand attention, her smile thin, practiced, almost bored, like she had already seen how this night would end and found it amusing, and if you had walked into that restaurant 10 minutes earlier, you would have thought it was just another high-end dinner. Another wealthy couple navigating polite conversation, but you would have been wrong, because beneath the tablecloth, beneath the polished silverware and carefully poured wine, something had already cracked long before anyone heard a sound, and Emily knew it. She had known it for weeks, maybe months, in the quiet spaces between unanswered texts and late-night excuses that never quite made sense, in the way Daniel stopped looking at her like she was part of his future and started treating her like a detail he could manage later. And still she showed up that night, because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive unless you're willing to sit across from it, even when it hurts, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost too calm, the kind of calm that comes from knowing there's no going back. I know about her, she said, not loud, not accusing, just clear enough to land exactly where it needed to, and for a fraction of a second, everything stopped. Daniel's expression didn't explode, it didn't even change much, just a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, the smallest fracture in control, but it was enough for Vanessa's smile to widen just slightly, enough for the tension to snap into something sharper, something irreversible, and around them. People pretended not to watch, but they were watching, because there is something about power unraveling in public that no one can ignore, and somewhere above it all, unnoticed, a small black dome in the corner of the ceiling continued to record everything without judgment, without emotion, capturing angles no one at the table could see. Because the most dangerous moments are never the loudest ones, they are the ones where someone believes they are still in control, and Daniel Hayes still believed exactly that. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that was what made it worse because silence from a man like him was never empty, it was calculated, it was the space where decisions were made and consequences quietly rearranged themselves around his comfort. And Emily felt it in the way his fingers rested against the table, not tense, not shaking, just still, as if he was choosing which version of this moment he wanted to exist in front of 60 strangers who suddenly mattered more than anything else in the room. Vanessa leaned back slightly, crossing her legs with effortless precision, her eyes moving between them like she was watching a performance she had already paid for, and Daniel finally exhaled, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to signal that he was about to speak, and when he did his voice came out controlled, almost bored. You should not be doing this here, Emily, he said, as if she had broken some invisible rule, as if the location mattered more than the truth sitting between them. Emily did not raise her voice, she did not cry, she simply held his gaze, and for the first time that night she did not look like someone asking for answers, she looked like someone who already had them. Then where should I do it, Daniel? She asked quietly. At home, where no one can hear it, or here where at least it is honest. And that was the moment the balance shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the air at nearby tables to tighten, for people to stop pretending they were not listening, because honesty in a room built on appearances always feels louder than any argument. Daniel's jaw moved slightly, a subtle sign of irritation, the kind he usually reserved for employees who disappointed him, but this was not a boardroom, and Emily was no longer playing the role he expected, and Vanessa's smile sharpened just a little more, as if she recognized the exact second control began slipping, not entirely but enough to matter. You are overreacting. Daniel continued, his tone flattening into something colder, something rehearsed. This is not what you think it is. And that sentence hung there heavy and familiar, the kind of sentence that had probably been used before in quieter rooms in softer tones, but tonight it sounded different, because Emily did not accept it. She did not look away, she did not shrink, she simply nodded once slowly, like she was acknowledging a script she had heard too many times. No, she said just as calmly. It is exactly what I think it is. And somewhere behind them a server froze mid-step, unsure whether to approach the table or disappear entirely, because moments like this do not belong on a menu, they do not come with instructions, and Daniel's eyes flickered briefly toward the surrounding tables, noticing the attention, noticing the weight of being watched, and for the first time that night something real passed through his expression, not anger, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when a man realizes this moment might not stay contained. And above them the small black dome continued to observe, capturing every glance, every word, every shift in tone, storing it without judgment, because cameras do not care about reputation, they do not care about power, they only care about what actually happens, and what was happening now was no longer something Daniel Hayes could quietly fix later, it was becoming something that would follow him long after the lights in that restaurant dimmed. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, and for a brief second he smiled, but it was not warmth, it was strategy, the kind of expression that had closed million-dollar deals and silenced rooms full of executives who thought they had leverage until they realized they did not. And he believed this would be no different, because in his world control was not something you lost, it was something you reasserted. Emily, you are tired, he said carefully, his voice lowering just enough to sound concerned to anyone listening without really hearing. You should not be out this late in your condition. And there it was, the shift, the subtle redirection from truth to narrative, from what was happening to what could be explained away, and a few tables nearby relaxed slightly because that explanation felt familiar. It gave them permission to look away again, to believe that what they were witnessing was not conflict but misunderstanding, something private that had simply spilled into the wrong place. But Emily did not move, she did not blink, she did not accept the version of her he was offering to the room, and instead she let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable again before speaking. Do not do that, she said softly, and those 3 words landed heavier than anything louder could have, because they were not emotional, they were precise. And Daniel's smile faded just a fraction as Vanessa shifted in her seat, clearly enjoying the tension now, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her wine glass as if she was marking time, waiting to see how far this would go. Do what? Daniel replied, though he already knew the answer, and Emily tilted her head slightly, studying him like someone seeing a stranger where a husband used to be. Do not turn me into a story. That makes you look better, she said, and for the first time that night a ripple moved through the room, not visible, not loud, but felt, in the way people leaned just slightly closer in their seats, in the way a man at the bar stopped mid-sentence because something about that line made it clear this was not ending quietly. And Daniel noticed it, he noticed all of it, the attention, the shifting energy, the fact that this moment was no longer contained between 3 people at one table. It was spreading. And that was something he could not allow, so he straightened his posture, adjusting his cuff, as if resetting himself into a version of control that had never failed him before. Enough, he said, not loudly but firmly, and the word carried authority, the kind that expected obedience. We are leaving, he added, already reaching for his wallet, as if ending the scene was as simple as paying for it. But Emily did not reach for her purse, she did not stand, she did not follow. And that small refusal, that quiet stillness, was louder than any argument, because it told the room something had changed permanently. No, she said just as calmly, and the word stopped him mid-motion, a clean break in the rhythm he had tried to re-establish, and for a moment neither of them moved, and in that stillness something invisible locked into place, something that would not undo itself later, no matter how much money or influence Daniel Hayes believed he had, because above them the camera continued to capture everything, the tone, the words, the choices, and somewhere in that silent recording a future was already forming, one where this night would not disappear, one where it would be replayed in a room where no one would look away and no one would accept his version of the truth. For a moment Daniel did not speak, and that silence was no longer controlled, it was fractured, the kind that appears when expectation fails and something unpredictable takes its place. And Emily could see it clearly now, not the man who once held her hand in quiet mornings, not the man who promised stability and future, but a version of him that existed only when he was being challenged in public, when his authority met resistance and did not immediately win. And Vanessa sensed it too, her posture straightening slightly, her interest sharpening because this was no longer a controlled situation, it was something closer to exposure, and Daniel slowly lowered his wallet back onto the table, not with force, not with anger, but with precision, like he was recalibrating a strategy that had suddenly become more complicated than expected. "You are making a scene," he said, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the pressure underneath, and that word "scene" hung in the air heavier than before because now it sounded less like an observation and more like an accusation, as if Emily had created something inappropriate instead of simply refusing to disappear, and she let out a quiet breath, one hand still resting protectively over her belly, grounding herself in something real, while everything else around her shifted into something artificial. "No, Daniel," she replied, her voice steady but no longer soft. "This was already a scene, you just expected me to stay quiet in it." And that line landed deeper than anything else had so far because it stripped away the illusion that this was sudden or emotional. It revealed that this moment had been building long before anyone else noticed, and across the room someone shifted in their chair, another person lowered their phone pretending they had not been recording, but the truth was already too present to ignore, and Daniel's gaze flickered briefly upward, not enough for anyone to notice consciously, but enough to catch a glimpse of something he did not register fully, the small black lens in the corner, still watching, still capturing every second, without bias, without loyalty, without fear. And then his attention snapped back to Emily, his expression hardening not into anger but into something colder, something more dangerous because it was controlled. "You need to think carefully about what you are doing right now," he said, and this time there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to disguise it as concern. It was a warning wrapped in calm language, the kind that relied on power rather than volume, and Emily understood exactly what it meant, the implications, the history behind it, the expectation that she would step back for the sake of comfort, for the sake of appearances, for the sake of everything that had always mattered more to him than truth. But this time she did not step back. This time she did not lower her eyes or shift the conversation into something safer. Instead, she leaned forward just slightly enough to close the distance between them, not aggressively, not emotionally, just deliberately. "I have thought about it," she said quietly, and there was something final in the way she spoke, something that did not leave room for reversal, and for a brief second Daniel's composure slipped, not dramatically, not visibly to most people, but enough for Vanessa to notice, enough for the energy at the table to change again, because the man who controlled outcomes was now facing one he could not easily rewrite. And around them the restaurant continued in fragments, silverware clinking softly, conversations resuming in cautious whispers, but at table 17 nothing moved forward, nothing resolved, because this was no longer a moment that could be smoothed over or forgotten. This was the point where everything that had been hidden stepped into light. And once something crosses that line, it does not return to what it was before. Vanessa was the first to break the stillness, but not with words, at least not right away. She let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, except it was too controlled, too measured to be genuine, and she tilted her head slightly, studying Emily with a kind of detached curiosity, like she was trying to understand how someone she had already dismissed could suddenly shift the entire atmosphere of a room without raising her voice. "You really believe this ends well for you?" Vanessa finally said, her tone light but edged with something sharper, something that carried confidence built on assumption, and Emily turned her gaze toward her slowly, not rushed, not reactive, just deliberate, as if she had been expecting that question all along. "It already ended, Vanessa," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only clarity, the kind that comes after something inside a person has already broken and settled into a new shape. And Vanessa's smile faltered just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for Daniel to catch it, enough to realize that whatever control he thought he had regained was slipping again in smaller, quieter ways that were harder to stop. And Daniel leaned forward, his voice lowering further, now no longer meant for the room but for Emily alone, though everyone close enough could still hear it. "You are not thinking about the consequences," he said, and that word consequences lingered heavier than before because it carried weight beyond the moment, beyond the dinner, beyond the eyes watching from nearby tables. And Emily's fingers tightened just slightly against the fabric of her dress, not in fear but in grounding, reminding herself of what mattered, of what could not be negotiated away this time. "I am the only one here who is thinking about them," she said softly, and that answer did not rise in volume, but it expanded in meaning, filling the space between them with something undeniable, something that could not be redirected or softened. And for a second Daniel had no immediate response, and that absence of control, that gap in his usual precision, was more revealing than anything he could have said because it showed the room what he looked like when the narrative was not his to command, and somewhere to their left a glass shifted slightly against the table, someone adjusting their seat, trying to pretend they were not part of what was unfolding but unable to fully detach, because moments like this do not belong only to the people inside them, they ripple outward, pulling witnesses into their gravity whether they want to be there or not, and above it all, the quiet hum of the restaurant continued, blending into the background as if normalcy was trying to reclaim space that no longer existed at that table. And then Daniel did something small, something almost insignificant, but it changed everything. He glanced around, not obviously, not dramatically, just enough to confirm what he already knew. People were watching more than before, paying attention in a way that could not be undone later, and when his eyes returned to Emily there was something different. There, not anger, not frustration, but calculation, the kind that appears when a man begins to understand that the cost of this moment might extend far beyond the room he is standing in, and Emily saw it. She recognized that shift immediately because she had lived inside his patterns long enough to know when he stopped reacting and started planning, and that was when she spoke again, not louder, not faster, just with a finality that left no space for reinterpretation. "You cannot fix this later," she said. And the words settled into the space between them like something permanent, something that would follow him long after this night ended, because the truth once spoken clearly in front of witnesses does not disappear. It waits, it records itself in memory, in silence, in unseen places, like the small camera in the corner that never stopped watching and never will forget. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, and then stopped, as if even that small movement had suddenly become too loud for the moment he was in, and for the first time that night he did not try to soften his expression, he did not try to reshape the situation into something presentable. He simply looked at Emily with a kind of stillness that carried more weight than any raised voice could have, and when he spoke again the tone had changed completely. "You are right about one thing," he said quietly, and that alone made the air shift, because agreement was not something he offered easily, especially not in front of witnesses. "This cannot be fixed later," he continued, and the words sounded almost calm, almost reasonable, except for the way they landed, heavier than expected, like something closing instead of opening, and Emily felt it immediately, the subtle shift from persuasion to something more final, more controlled, and she held her ground, her posture steady, her breathing measured, because she understood now that this was no longer about what had happened, it was about what he would do next. And Vanessa leaned slightly forward, her interest sharpening again, sensing that something was about to break through the careful balance that had been holding the scene together up until now. "Then maybe you should stop before it gets worse," Vanessa added lightly, as if offering advice, though the undertone carried something else. Something closer to challenge, and Daniel did not look at her. He did not acknowledge the comment at all, which in itself was unusual, because he always acknowledged control wherever it came from, but right now his focus remained entirely on Emily, and that silence toward Vanessa was its own kind of statement, one that suggested he was narrowing the situation down to a single point, a single outcome, and Emily noticed that too. She noticed everything now, the way his shoulders squared, the way his gaze steadied, the way the room seemed to fade out of his awareness, even though it was still full of people watching, waiting, recording in their own quiet ways. And somewhere near the entrance a server hesitated, holding a tray mid-step, unsure whether to approach or retreat, because whatever this was, it no longer resembled a normal dinner interaction. It had become something heavier, something that did not belong in a place built on appearances and comfort. And then Daniel spoke again, slower this time, each word deliberate. "You should leave," he said, and there was no softness in it, no attempt to disguise it as concern or suggestion. It was a directive, clean and controlled, and Emily felt a brief stillness inside her, not fear, not hesitation, just the recognition of a line being drawn, and for a second the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would follow the pattern that had always existed between them, if she would stand, if she would gather her things, if she would allow the moment to close quietly under his terms. But she did not move, she did not reach for her purse, she did not shift in her seat, she simply looked at him, and in that stillness there was something stronger than defiance, something more permanent than resistance. It was the absence of compliance, and that absence created a kind of silence that no one at the surrounding tables could ignore anymore, because now it was clear this was not an argument that would resolve itself, this was something that had already crossed into consequence. And Daniel saw it, he saw the stillness, the refusal, the shift in her that could not be undone, and for a brief fraction of a second something real passed through his expression, something that had nothing to do with control or image, something closer to the realization that this moment was no longer contained within his reach, and above them the camera remained fixed, capturing everything without interruption, because moments like this do not announce their importance while they are happening, they simply unfold and later they become the evidence no one can deny. Emily did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than anything that had been said, because now it was no longer about words, it was about choice, and everyone close enough to feel it understood that this was the moment where something irreversible would happen one way or another. And Daniel waited, his gaze fixed on her with a patience that no longer felt calm, it felt like pressure, like the kind that builds quietly until something gives. And Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair, crossing her arms, now her earlier amusement fading into something more observant, because even she could sense that whatever control Daniel thought he had was not landing the way it used to. And Emily slowly lifted her hand from the table, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to adjust the edge of her sleeve, a small grounding movement that seemed almost insignificant except for the way it revealed how steady she actually was. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not shake, it simply carried across the space between them with a clarity that cut through everything else. "No," she said, and that single word landed heavier than any argument that could have followed, because it was not reactive, it was final. And Daniel blinked once, not out of confusion, but out of recalculation, because refusal was not something he was accustomed to receiving, not like this, not in front of people who were now openly watching, and the shift in the room became impossible to ignore. Conversations had not resumed, they had only quieted into something more focused, more aware, and somewhere behind Emily a chair moved slightly, someone adjusting their position to see more clearly, and Daniel's jaw tightened just enough to register the change. His authority had not disappeared, but it had been challenged publicly, and that was something he could not allow to stand without response. "You are not understanding the situation," he said, his voice lower, now more controlled than before, but carrying an edge that had not been there earlier, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I understand it perfectly," she replied, and for a brief moment neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, and that stillness was louder than anything else in the room, because it made one thing unmistakably clear: this was no longer a private disagreement, this was a public fracture, and once something breaks in front of witnesses it does not return to what it was before. And Vanessa exhaled softly, almost under her breath, but not quite enough to go unnoticed. "This is getting unnecessary," she said, her tone shifting slightly, no longer playful, no longer amused, but edged with irritation, because the situation was no longer entertaining, it was becoming unpredictable. And Daniel did not respond to her, he did not even glance in her direction, because his attention remained locked on Emily, and that silence toward Vanessa was louder than any acknowledgement could have been. It told the room exactly where the real conflict was, and Emily felt it too, the narrowing of focus, the way everything else seemed to fall away, leaving only the truth that had finally surfaced, and could not be pushed back down. And then Daniel leaned forward just slightly enough to close the distance again, his voice quieter now but sharper. "You are making a mistake," he said, and this time it did not sound like a warning, it sounded like a conclusion. And Emily's expression did not change, she did not flinch, she did not look away, she simply held his gaze and answered with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every word she had spoken so far. "No, Daniel," she said. "I am finally not making one." And somewhere above them the camera continued to record every second of it, not the volume, not the tension, but the choices, the words, the truth unfolding in real time, because what people forget in moments like this is that it is not the loudest action that defines what happens next, it is the quiet decisions made when everyone is watching and no one can pretend they did not see it. Daniel's expression settled into something unreadable, and that was when the room changed again, not loudly, not suddenly, but in the way tension shifts when a line has already been crossed, and no one is pretending anymore, because Emily had not just refused him, she had exposed something deeper, something that could not be redirected into politeness or dismissed as emotion. And for a moment he said nothing at all, he simply looked at her, as if measuring the distance between what he expected and what was actually happening, and that distance had never felt wider. "You think this ends here?" he said finally, his voice steady but carrying something colder beneath it, something that did not need volume to be felt. And Emily did not look away, she did not soften, she simply held that space with a calm that no longer came from hope, it came from certainty. It already did. she answered, and that was when the last layer of illusion between them seemed to fall away, because there was no argument left in her, no attempt to convince him, no expectation that he would understand, only the quiet acknowledgement that whatever they had once built no longer existed in any real form. And Vanessa shifted again, this time more noticeably. Her posture no longer relaxed, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her glass, because the situation had moved beyond her control as well, and she was no longer certain how it would unfold. And Daniel noticed everything: the room, the attention, the stillness, the fact that every movement now carried weight and consequence, and he leaned back slightly, his chair making the faintest sound against the floor, not aggressive, not abrupt, but enough to mark a change in position, a shift from engagement to distance, as if he was stepping back, not physically but strategically. "You are going to regret this," he said, and there was no emphasis, no raised tone, just a statement delivered with quiet confidence, the kind that had likely influenced countless outcomes in his favor before. But Emily's response did not match the expectation built into his words. She did not react, she did not defend. She simply nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging that possibility without fear. "Maybe," she said, and for a fraction of a second that single word unsettled the entire dynamic, because it did not reject his statement, it did not challenge it simply removed its power, and that absence of resistance left nothing for him to push against, and that was something far more difficult to control. And somewhere near the edge of the room a phone lowered slightly, someone realizing that what they were witnessing was no longer just a moment, it was becoming something that would matter later, something that would not stay contained within the walls of this restaurant. And above them the camera continued its silent work, capturing angles that memory alone could not hold, recording not just the words, but the timing, the space between them, the way control had shifted, without force, without volume, without anything dramatic enough to warn anyone what it would become. And Daniel's gaze flickered once more across the room, not searching, not panicked, just aware. And when it returned to Emily, there was something final in it, not defeat, not yet, but recognition, the understanding that whatever happened next would not erase what had already been seen and heard. And Emily felt that too. She felt the moment settle into something permanent, something that would not change with apologies or explanations, because truth once spoken clearly in front of witnesses does not fade, it waits, it remains, it becomes something that cannot be negotiated away. And in that quiet realization, the distance between them was no longer measured in inches across the table, it was measured in everything that would follow after this night ended. Emily became aware of the smallest details in that moment: the faint hum of the air conditioning, the soft clink of glass somewhere across the room, the distant murmur of a conversation that was trying to pretend normalcy still existed, and yet everything around her felt sharpened, like the world had narrowed into something precise, something undeniable. And she slowly drew a breath, her hand resting again against her belly, grounding herself in something real, something that mattered, beyond the eyes watching, beyond the tension sitting across from her. And when she looked back at Daniel, there was no hesitation left in her expression, no uncertainty, no question about what came next, only clarity. "I am leaving," she said, and the words did not sound like retreat, they sounded like decision, and that difference shifted the weight of the moment completely, because leaving on her terms was not the same as being dismissed. It was not compliance, it was control reclaimed in the quietest way possible. And Daniel's gaze followed her carefully, measuring every movement, as she reached for her bag, not hurried, not nervous, just deliberate. And Vanessa leaned back slightly again, her expression unreadable now, the earlier confidence replaced by something closer to observation, because whatever outcome she had expected, this was not it. And as Emily stood, the room seemed to react without meaning to chairs stilled, conversations paused, eyes followed her, not openly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, because people recognize turning points even when they do not understand them fully. And she did not rush. She did not look around, she simply adjusted the fabric of her coat over her shoulders and took a single step back from the table, creating a distance that had not existed before. And Daniel remained seated for a second longer than expected, his posture unchanged, his expression controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain, something that could not be covered by confidence alone. "Emily," he said, and this time her name carried something different, not authority, not warning, but a trace of something he had not allowed before, something closer to realization. And she paused, not turning fully back, not stepping forward again, just enough to acknowledge that he had spoken. And the silence between them stretched once more, but it no longer held tension, it held conclusion. And when she finally turned her head slightly, her voice was quiet but unmistakably final. "This is where it stops," she said, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, no Demand only truth stated without decoration, and Daniel did not respond immediately because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to redirect, and somewhere above them the camera captured the exact angle of that moment, the way she stood, the way he remained seated, the space between them now defined not by proximity, but by everything that had been said and everything that would follow, and Emily took another step, this time moving away from the table, fully her path clear, not because the room parted dramatically, but because people instinctively made space when something real passed through their presence, and as she walked toward the exit the quiet followed her, not as silence but as recognition, because every person who had witnessed even a fraction of that exchange understood in some unspoken way that what had just happened would not stay in that room, it would not fade into the background of another expensive evening, it would continue, it would surface again in places where control could not rewrite it. And behind her Daniel finally stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a measured movement that suggested he was already thinking ahead, already calculating outcomes beyond the moment. But even as he did, there was one thing he could not change, something already set into motion, something that had been recorded not just in memory, but in a way that would not forget. And as Emily reached the door she did not look back, because some endings do not need witnesses to confirm them, they only need the certainty of the person walking away. The door closed behind Emily with a soft click that no one else in the restaurant would remember, but Daniel Hayes would replay it later with a clarity that refused to fade, because it was not just a sound, it was a line being drawn in a way he could not immediately control, and for a few seconds he remained standing exactly where she had left him, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair, his posture still composed, but no longer anchored to anything stable, and Vanessa watched him closely now, no longer hiding her curiosity, because whatever confidence she had carried into that dinner had shifted into something more cautious, more observant, as if she was seeing a side of him that did not usually surface in controlled environments. "You should sit down," she said quietly, her tone softer than before, not out of concern but calculation, and Daniel did not respond right away. He simply turned his head slightly toward the direction Emily had walked, as if measuring distance not in feet, but in consequence, and then slowly he reached for his jacket, adjusting it with the same precise movements that had defined him all evening. But there was something different now, something less certain beneath the surface, and across the room the low hum of conversation began to return, not fully, not naturally, but in fragments, people speaking in quieter tones, glancing toward table 17 with the kind of restrained curiosity that follows something they know they were not meant to witness. And Daniel finally sat down, his expression settling back into composure, but it felt thinner now, like a layer that no longer held the same weight, and Vanessa leaned slightly forward, her voice low. "This does not have to become a problem," she said, and that word problem lingered because it carried more than just the moment, it carried implication, reputation, image, everything that lived outside the walls of that restaurant. And Daniel's eyes shifted to meet hers, and for the first time that night there was no immediate agreement, no effortless alignment in his response. Instead there was a pause long enough to register that something had changed. "It already is," he said, and his voice remained calm, but the words landed differently because they were not dismissive, they were not strategic, they were simply true. And Vanessa's expression tightened just slightly, as if she was recalculating her own position in a situation that was no longer predictable. And somewhere near the bar a man quietly set his phone down, the screen still faintly glowing, as if holding on to a moment that had not fully ended, and above them the small black camera continued to do what it had done all night, capturing, without interruption, without opinion, storing everything exactly as it happened, not as it might later be explained or reframed. And Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze unfocused for a brief second, not because he was lost, but because he was thinking ahead, moving beyond the room, beyond the dinner, beyond the immediate reactions, to something larger, something that would unfold outside of his usual influence. And for a moment the weight of that realization settled in a way he could not immediately shift, and Vanessa broke the silence again, more carefully this time. "What are you going to do?" she asked, and Daniel's fingers stilled completely on the table before he answered, not looking at her, not looking at anyone else, just forward into something only he could see. "I will handle it," he said, and under normal circumstances that statement would have carried certainty, authority, resolution, but tonight it lingered. differently because for the first time there was something missing from it, something that could not be replaced by confidence alone, and somewhere far from that table Emily stepped into the night air carrying nothing with her except the quiet certainty that what had been hidden was no longer hers to carry, and inside the restaurant the moment did not end, it simply shifted into something that would follow them all long after the lights dimmed and the tables were cleared, because some nights do not stay where they happen, they move, they surface, they become something that no one involved can fully control once they begin. 3 days later the city had already moved on the way it always does, swallowing moments whole and replacing them with newer distractions, brighter headlines, louder conversations, but some things do not disappear, they settle, they wait, they resurface in quieter, more precise ways, and inside a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of Hayes Financial Group the air felt different, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the subtle shifts that only those who work there every day could notice. Conversation stopping half a second too soon, eyes avoiding contact for just a moment longer than usual, and Daniel Hayes stood at the head of the table reviewing a report that he had already read twice, his expression unchanged, his posture controlled, but the room was not responding to him the way it used to. And across the table 2 senior partners exchanged a glance so brief it could have been missed by anyone not looking for it. And Daniel noticed everything he always did, but this time noticing did not give him the same advantage, because whatever had shifted was not happening in front of him, it was happening around him, and just as he set the report down his phone vibrated once against the polished surface of the table, a quiet sound but loud enough in the silence that followed, and for a moment he did not reach for it, not immediately, as if some instinct told him that whatever was waiting on that screen was not something he could redirect or delay. And when he finally picked it up his eyes moved quickly, scanning the message without reaction, but his hand stilled completely as he read the second line and the third and the fourth, because it was not just a message, it was a link, and not just any link, one that had already been viewed thousands of times, shared across platforms, that did not ask permission before amplifying what they found, and without saying a word Daniel tapped the screen and the video opened, instantly grainy but clear enough, unmistakable in its angle, the lighting, the positioning, the exact layout of table 17, and for a fraction of a second the room seemed to narrow again, just like it had that night, but this time there was no restaurant, no controlled environment, no illusion of privacy, only the undeniable reality of something captured exactly as it happened, and the silence in the conference room deepened, not because anyone else had seen the video yet, but because Daniel had, and whatever composure he carried was now being tested in a way it had never been before. And across the table one of the partners shifted slightly, his eyes flicking toward the phone and then away, as if sensing the change without fully understanding it, and Daniel slowly lowered the device back onto the table, his expression unchanged, but something beneath it no longer aligned with the control he had built his entire life around. "We will continue this later," he said calmly, closing the report in front of him, and the meeting ended without question, without resistance, because authority still existed in his voice, but it no longer carried the same certainty, and as the room emptied one by one the quiet followed them out, leaving Daniel alone with the reflection of the city in the glass behind him, and the small glowing screen in front of him where the video remained paused, waiting not for explanation, not for justification, but simply existing as truth in a form that could not be undone, because some moments do not need interpretation, they only need to be seen, and once they are, they stop belonging to the people who created them, and start belonging to everyone else. By the end of the day, the video was no longer just a link, it had become a headline, not officially, not through any traditional channel, but in the way information spreads now, fast, fragmented, impossible to contain. And inside Daniel's office the silence felt heavier than the noise outside, because every notification, every vibration of his phone carried the same message in different forms. The same footage, the same angle, the same undeniable sequence that no statement could soften, and he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, his reflection faint against the glass, his posture still composed but no longer untouched by what was unfolding, and behind him on the large screen mounted to the wall his assistant had paused the video mid-frame, not out of instruction, but uncertainty, unsure whether to let it play or remove it entirely, because even without motion the image itself was enough to say everything that needed to be said. And Daniel did not turn around, he did not look at it again, because he already knew what it showed, not in fragments, not in interpretation, but in exact detail, and that was the problem. There was no room left for reinterpretation, no space to reshape it into something else. And his phone rang again, this time a direct call, not a message, not a notification, and he let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "Yes," And the voice on the other end did not waste time, it never did. "We need to address this immediately," the partner said, and the words carried urgency, not panic, but something close to it, the kind that appears when reputation begins to move beyond internal control. And Daniel listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the skyline as if distance could offer clarity. "There is nothing to address yet," he replied calmly, but even as he said it the words felt thinner than they would have just days before, because the situation was no longer confined to internal discussion. It had moved beyond that into something public, something shared, something that did not wait for permission to exist, and there was a pause on the other end long enough to register disagreement. "It is already being addressed for us," the partner responded, and that was the first moment Daniel allowed himself to turn slightly, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge the reality behind him, the paused image on the screen, the still frame of a moment that had once belonged to a private setting and now belonged to everyone who had seen it, and everyone who would see it next, and he exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling not as surprise but as inevitability, because deep down he understood something he had never needed to consider before: control only works when the narrative stays contained, and this was no longer contained. And as the call ended he placed the phone down with deliberate care, his movements still precise, still controlled, but now carrying something else beneath them, something that could not be corrected by strategy alone. And across the city Emily sat in a quiet office across from a woman named Rachel Bennett, a legal folder open between them. Documents neatly arranged but untouched for the moment, because either of them was looking at the papers. They were looking at the screen in front of them, where the same video played once more, not as shock, not as revelation, but as confirmation. And Emily did not react outwardly, she did not look away, she simply watched with a calm that had replaced everything else, because what had once been hidden was now visible in a way that did not rely on her voice, did not require her explanation. And Rachel finally spoke, her tone measured. "This changes everything." And Emily nodded once, not because she was surprised, but because she already knew the truth had not just surfaced, it had found its way into a form that could not be ignored. And once that happens, the outcome is no longer a matter of if only. When 2 weeks later the courtroom was quieter than anyone expected, not empty, but contained the kind of silence that settles when people understand they are about to witness something that does not need performance to carry weight. And Emily sat beside Rachel Bennett, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her posture steady, not because she felt no emotion, but because she no longer needed to show it. And across the room Daniel Hayes sat with his legal team, his expression composed, his suit immaculate, every detail controlled as it had always been, except now control felt different. It felt like something being held together rather than something naturally owned. And the judge entered without ceremony, taking his seat as the room rose and then settled again, and for a moment nothing happened, no dramatic opening, no raised voices, only the quiet shuffle of documents, and the faint sound of a pen against paper, as if the room itself was preparing for something inevitable rather than unexpected. And when Rachel stood, she did not rush, she did not perform, she simply moved with the confidence of someone who understood that the most powerful moments do not require volume. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear but measured, "this case does not rely on interpretation, it relies on record." And those words settled into the room with a weight that did not need explanation, because everyone present understood exactly what she meant. And Daniel's gaze remained forward, his expression unchanged, but his hands rested completely still on the table in front of him, as if even the smallest movement might draw attention to something he could no longer redirect. And Rachel turned slightly toward the screen position near the bench, not dramatically, not for effect, just enough to acknowledge what was about to happen. "With the court's permission, we would like to present video evidence obtained from the location on the night in question," she said, and the judge nodded once, no hesitation. No need for elaboration, because the existence of that footage had already moved beyond doubt, and as the screen came to life the room did not react outwardly. There was no audible gasp, no visible shock, only a deeper silence. As the image appeared, the familiar layout of table 17, the lighting, the positioning, the exact details that had once existed in private, and now existed in a space where truth was not optional. And Emily did not look at Daniel, she did not shift in her seat, she simply watched the screen with the same calm she had carried since the moment she chose to walk away, because this was no longer about proving something, it was about allowing what already existed to be seen. And Daniel did not look away either, his gaze fixed on the screen, his expression steady, but the stillness in his posture carried something Different now, not control, not confidence, but recognition, the understanding that this moment was no longer his to shape, and as the video continued there was no commentary, no need for explanation, because the clarity